All right. Good morning, everybody. Having a little bit of Pete's coffee this morning. Today, we're talking about psychedelics in shamanism. Um, so I'll talk a little bit, just because I know it takes a few minutes for everybody to join up, and so um, I usually just talk around a little bit, but uh, I'll just I'll lead in by saying this, and if you're catching this, good morning. Always the first one on, and it's a good morning to you as well. Nice to see you today. Um, obviously nothing. I'm not a doctor. I'm not um, a lawyer. I can't give legal or medical advice here, but I want to talk a little bit about psychedelics and shamanism, and I think there is this idea, or at least there was. I don't know how prevalent it is anymore. That all shamanic cultures use psychedelics or entheogens, and that's not exactly true. And well, it's not true. There is widespread use of what we call psychedelics, and I'm going to use different terms as I talk about this. Most people know psychedelics or hallucinogens. Another term is entheogen, which is another term coming from the Greek, meaning something that gives you an internal experience of divinity. And I will talk about how the ancient Greeks used psychedelics back in the day. Uh, but it's a really interesting topic, and there is a ton of medical research being done right now. There was a dearth, you know, back in the day. We had, when they developed LSD, for example, quickly they banned. They've been quick to ban all psychedelics and all psychedelic research. I think people were not really cautious with its use in research settings, and certainly the government did experiments. They did experiments where they were dosing people who hadn't consented, and there were all kinds of stuff. Good morning. There was all kinds of stuff going on, and so they had been really quick to ban it and not grant. Um, you have to get permission, I guess, from the FDA or whoever to do medical research with psychedelics. But now we see this resurgence. There have been a lot of movements to um, use psychedelics in medical settings. Yeah. So I'll talk about that a little bit. One of the things about the use of psychedelics for therapeutic or spiritual reasons is set and setting are really important. And so people who often use substances just to get high recreationally and don't really have the proper setting and the proper set, which is mindset intention behind what they're doing, don't get the same experience as somebody who does. Those things are incredibly important. There are a lot of people, and I'm not one, but there are a lot of people who are now training as, um, I forget what you would call it, like a psychedelic guide, psychedelic experience guide, to help create sacred containers for people to have these experiences. So, set and setting are incredibly powerful parts. And that being said, not everybody is ready for a spiritual breakthrough, right? Not every person is um, prepared for that, ready for that, that sort of thing. And so people can have negative experiences, quote unquote negative experiences. I don't think it's that black and white, but people have experiences that they tag as negative, and bad trips or whatever, um because they're not necessarily prepared for prepared for what's going to happen. And so there's been a tremendous amount of research. So they're using ketamine. Ketamine is a legally prescribed drug. It's used as a tranquilizer. It's used as for pain alleviation. I don't know how much it's used for pain or in hospital settings, but what they found, because they were using it on the battlefields in Vietnam, the medics had ketamine to calm people down who'd been injured. Um, these people were having symptoms of PTSD go away, and they use it to this day. Um, the paramedics will show up if somebody is in crisis. The paramedics will show up with ketamine. If they have to sedate somebody, they'll use ketamine. And they found that they would like give somebody a fairly high dose, I guess, of ketamine, which, people use as a club drug. It's very dissociative. And, people would have alleviation from depressive symptoms for weeks after that. So nowadays, you can get prescribed either low dose ketamine for depression, or it's off books. It's not, the FDA doesn't recognize it for that use, but you can still get a prescription for it. Or you can go to clinics and do sort of high dose ketamine infusion therapy. Um, Low dose is you would take a troche, which is a thing you stick up in your gum and it melts. Like it's probably not too much like candy, but like like a piece of candy. Um, as opposed to infusion, which is obviously an IV where they give you a much larger dose. Um, and there has been astounding um, results from its conscious use this way, because it um beyond masking symptoms, which is how most antidepressants work, right? You get a serotonin uh SSRI um reuptake inhibitor, and you take that and it's gonna, it may, if it works for you, and they tend to work for about 50 to 60% of people, and even then they might not work that well. um, you know that's going to give you a boost as long as you're taking that medication, but it doesn't affect neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is the quality that your brain has to make new and stronger neural pathways. And one of the issues, particularly with trauma, and I come from a trauma background, one of the issues with trauma is that it actually causes damage to the brain. It causes certain pathways to get cut off, and so you're not healing trauma with SSRIs. Not to take anything away from anybody who takes them. I'm just using this as a way to sort of compare the difference. And then one of the nice things is apparently you can take ketamine with SSRIs because it doesn't act on serotonin. Right. The danger of taking too much stuff that there's a danger in having too much serotonin in your system. So ketamine is, I guess, considered a psychedelic. With enough of it, you certainly can have hallucinations. Um, Low doses, you don't have. You definitely, there are distortions in reality and that sort of thing, but not like you're not seeing things the way you might with some other substances. Um, so there are, ketamine, MDMA, LSD are kind of the artificially created stuff, and MDMA right now, is being FDA cleared for PTSD treatments. So MDMA, if you don't know, is either, the street name for that is ecstasy or Molly. I'm not a drug expert. Um, but it's considered a psychedelic. It definitely can affect empathy, right? Which is an important characteristic. but it's in third stage clinical trials right now in the US anyway for treating PTSD, which means we're really really close to having it cleared for use for PTSD, which I think is fantastic. We have been really bad at, Western medicine has been really really bad at treating PTSD forever. Um, Shamans have been really great at treating PTSD for thousands of years. And so I think it's important to pay attention to traditional treatments. You look at an indigenous culture that's been around for thousands of years, surviving in harsh conditions, and now I realize most, not all, but most indigenous people probably have access to modern Western medicine, but that wasn't always the case. And so they had to be able to take care of themselves. They had to, like, if you meet somebody who's like a native, wherever you live, um, a native herbalist, for example, they can go out and, you know, in your backyard and find 15 or 20 or 30 things to treat all kinds of ailments, right? Because they had to. That was survival for their tribe forever. And they got to know all of the characteristics of the various plants and things. And so one of the terms that I'll use in talking about psychedelics in their use in shamanism is plant medicine, even though not all psychedelics are plants. Obviously, mushrooms are not plants; they're a different kingdom altogether. Interesting fact: mushrooms and human beings are much closer genetically than mushrooms and plants are. Um, we we diverged later on the evolutionary tree than plants did. And mushrooms breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. It's one of the big differences. Fungi, but mushrooms are a type of fungi. I- One of the big differences between mushrooms and plants. Mushrooms have a digestive system. It happens to be external, so they're the mycelium, which is the stuff that grows under the surface, and the mushroom pops out. That's just the fruiting body. That's the thing that reproduces, that drops the spores. It's their reproductive organ, for lack of a better term. Um, anyway, generally speaking, plant medicine is the term, even though mushrooms aren't plants. Of course, traditionally, shamans were not using synthetic medications like MDMA or that, but um, they were using very powerful. The ones that use substances using very powerful things. There is iboga from Africa, which is um, used in a lot of places to treat addiction to other chemicals, including uh, opioids. Um, Very, very powerful psychedelic. You've got DMT, which is the chemical component, the active psychedelic chemical component in ayahuasca. I'll talk about ayahuasca a bit here. A lot of people are very interested in ayahuasca. I understand it's DMT is called by some the spirit molecule or the God molecule. Um, Very, very powerful psychedelic. Um, so Iboga DMT by way of ayahuasca, um, psilocin, which is what psilocybin has, the active component of that. Actually, there's more than one, but psilocin is the one people know most about, and comes from there are I don't know how many dozens anyway of species of fungus, not just mushrooms. Oh, ghost pipe. Yeah, I've heard something about that. They can't perform photosynthesis and get all their huh, interesting. So probably very close to somewhere on the evolutionary line to mushrooms. I'll have to look that up. I think I've heard of that. Um but I am certainly no expert, no plant expert, although I'm getting to know the plants around me. I found, just the other day, on my in my yard, a huge amount of, an a plant called sweet fern. They're not actually ferns, even though they're called sweet ferns, and they have, tons of uh, indigenous people use them for tons of medicinal purposes. They're astringent. They use them for stomach problems. They use them like for poison ivy, bug bites, skin, all kinds of skin conditions. You can make it into a tea. You can just eat the leaves. They have a really cool smell. Um, but yeah, tons and tons of. I'm starting to get to know know things, particularly in my local area. Um, because that is it's a kind of an important consideration. What is near you, that sort of thing. So peyote obviously is a cactus, type of cactus, which is a plant, that's used by, predominantly Native American. Of course, anybody who's interested can probably find peyote, but used spiritually by, many Native American tribes. In fact, they have special licenses for people to go out and collect, peyote. And I don't know if it's a special license, but they have legal authority to go out and collect, um, peyote buttons and, use them in ceremony. And so there's a huge interest in psychedelics right now, in part, because I think because there's a lot of media. There's documentaries about the use of psychedelics. There's, and some popular ones that you've got, guys like Joe Rogan talking about the use of psychedelics. He's got a wildly popular podcast. I won't opine about Joe Rogan, but he's got a following, and he talks about the use of cannabis. And I don't know if we consider cannabis a psychedelic, but it certainly can be, and it certainly can be used in ceremony as well. It is psychoactive for sure, as anybody who's ever used cannabis knows. So yeah, so depending on your state, there are a couple of states, to my knowledge, that don't allow you to have psilocybin spores, and the reason for that is the spores don't contain psilocin. But if you grow them, the mycelium, so spores are obviously they're the reproductive parts of the mushroom. When the mushroom comes up out of the ground or wherever it comes out of and opens up, it drops spores. And those are like seeds. They're not seeds, but they're like that from a plant. And those, if they fall in a favorable place, will reproduce. So the spores of psilocybin mushrooms don't, have any psilocin in them. So in most places in the U.S. anyway, my understanding is it's legal to, have spores because people use them for microscopy, looking at them under a microscope and studying them and that sort of thing. But as soon as you put them into some kind of growth medium, it's illegal once they start forming mycelium. Which to me points to a little bit of some of the ridiculousness around the restrictions on, psychoactive substances. I'm actually, um, personally, I believe that we should decriminalize at least psilocybin and probably a bunch of other things. It's interesting. I live in Maine in the U.S. and, I lived in Massachusetts when they, well, let's put it this way. So I live in Maine. They made medical marijuana legal some time ago, and there was a ton of pushback. Um, oh, yeah. I'm not sure where you live, and I'm not that familiar with Yage, but, is it pronounced Yage or Yahe? I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it, but, or where you are, but yeah, you can, depending on where you live, there are obviously different things. Yes, it is about the intention. That's the set and setting. You're the environment that you're in, and the intention behind what you do when you use it, which is why ceremony is really important. Ceremony helps create the setting, but also the correct mindset for doing some of these things. So, oh, Colombia, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, yep, yep, and ayahuasca is legal in a lot of places as well. And you can, I just talked to somebody yesterday who's going to Peru. Um, Got to be cautious. Yahe is oh, it is ayahuasca. Oh, it's the same thing. Okay. Thank you. See, I always learn stuff every time I one of the reasons why I love doing this is that um I always learn something from people when they come on. Cool. So same thing. Yeah. And so you can find in many places it's it's either not it's not criminalized in many places you can find, and there are people who are doing it in the US, and the legality is really iffy there. In the US there are people who are doing ayahuasca in the US. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you love this conversation. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining. um Anyway, so there are all kinds of psychedelics. So one that always amuses me a little bit is the Amanita muscaria, which is known as the fly agaric mushroom. When you see when you see mushrooms with red caps that have these white dots around them, that's usually Amanita muscaria, which is a psychedelic mushroom that grows a lot in throughout northern Europe. I think they may grow in the U.S. as well, but if they do, they're probably a transplant of some sort. But definitely all over Europe. And it's funny because if you remember when I was a kid, we used to watch the Smurfs. The Smurfs were really big, and they lived in these mushrooms with red caps and white dots on them. And I'm like, and the Mario Brothers whole franchise, Super Mario and all that stuff. Um, there were the mushrooms that were Amanita muscaria. These are psychedelic mushrooms, and they're used in interesting ways by Northern European shamans. They're very difficult to digest and very difficult to get the psychedelic chemicals out of. So one way, they're considered neurotoxic. So one way they are used, and this is a story that always makes me chuckle a little bit, is they're fed to reindeer, or the reindeer find them and eat them. These northern tribes that herd reindeer, and the reindeer urinate into the snow, and apparently the processing of the chemical in Amanita muscaria leaves enough in of the psychedelic element in the urine that the urine can be consumed and then reconsumed. So the shaman would get the snow that the reindeer has urinated into, melt it down and drink it. Sounds gross, but whatever. I don't want to judge somebody else's culture. Um, Drink it, and then they would urinate into a cup or whatever, and then pass that around to the members of the tribe, and it would still contain enough. And apparently, it can go through like 5 times people's urine and still carry enough chemicals. So, you've got the red and white caps, you've got the reindeer who are high, you've got the shaman who often would wear like red robes, and they might slide down the tent pole of the yurt or whatever they were in. They would climb up the outside and slide down in during ceremony. And then you think about all of the stuff about Santa Claus coming from the North Pole, having flying reindeer sliding down through the chimney. And I wrote an article years ago about, saying that Santa Claus was a shaman. and the legend of Santa Claus borrows from all kinds of different traditions. The real Saint Nicholas was from Turkey, um, and not from, but it's Datura. Yeah, yeah. I'm not that familiar with Datura. I know it from reading. I know it from reading about it, basically. Not incredibly familiar with it, but I know it is very in their Datura is like a family of plants, and there's some of them that have psychoactive components and some that don't. Traditionally used, as you said, by Navajo, but also south of the border, um, in tribes in Mexico. So sort of southwestern U.S., Mexico, that area is a common plant. I don't know what the active chemical, if it's DMT or something else. Thing with DMT, one of the things with ayahuasca, for example, is that it's very difficult to digest by eating because of the stomach chemicals will DMT anyway. It will break it down, and so you don't get enough of it. So some people, they'll smoke DMT or something, um, but the ayahuasca is mixed. The DMT bearing plants are mixed with plants that are MAOI inhibitors that inhibit the breakdown of the DMT in your stomach. So then it can pass through into your bloodstream and you get the effect. It is absolutely amazing to me, stunning to me that cultures without knowledge of modern chemistry, modern equipment, modern medical studies found these combinations of plants that have to be brewed in very specific ways to work. Oh, interesting. It's the weed that got in the water in the Old West and made horses crazy. Ah, interesting. Um, yeah, certainly if you're not if you're unintentionally dosed with something that can be very dangerous. Um, so it's absolutely amazing to me that ayahuasca in particular has to contain a combination of plants and for it to work. You can't just have the psychoactive component, the DMT, because consuming it by mouth it breaks down. Um, there are people who will smoke DMT. That's I don't have any experience with it, so I don't know how different that is. Other than I know people who smoke DMT have an experience that is very intense, but much shorter than the ayahuasca experience. 20 minutes or something along those lines. So yeah, I have heard of datura. So there are all kinds of substances used by different indigenous cultures all over the world. The other the other interesting aspect is many forms of spirituality, non-shamanic forms of spirituality, and forms that incorporated shamanic practice into their belief system, to this day, or in early history until they stopped, used psychedelics. So an example of that is tantric Buddhism in Nepal and Tibet. They have a substance known as amrita. Amrita is um, a mixture of psychedelics, and it's part of the secret, maybe not so secret because there are books written about it these days, but for a very, very long time as part of the inner esoteric teaching of tantric Buddhism. you know a lot of these I've practiced tantric Buddhism, and there's a lot of visualizing yourself at the middle of a mandala with a god in front of you, and this and very complex stuff. And the use of amrita amongst, I think, just amongst monks. I don't think they have ceremonies for lay people with amrita, but And I believe the psychoactive component to that is psilocybin. Um, but you know, they experience it in a much more real way. It allows them to open up and experience those spiritual worlds much more intensely and have these, um, opening spiritual experiences. We see this. There was a substance used, mentioned in the Vedas in India called soma, and we don't know what components were in soma, but all of the descriptions of it are that it was a psychedelic brew, most likely containing mushrooms, but potentially containing other things. We have in ancient Greece, we have kaikon. Kaikon was a type of beer, but it was brewed with ergot infested, I think barley, and purposefully ergot infested. And ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on grain, and it produces. It's the precursor to LSD. We'll put it that way. LSD is synthesized from ergot, and obviously LSD has a lot more processing, but for thousands of years, ancient Greeks, tens of thousands a year, would go to these mystery schools, right? The most famous one is at Eleusis in Greece, and they would drink kaikon and go through ceremony. And the whole idea was to become one, to experience their consciousness merging with their gods. They would put on plays, while people were under the influence. They would have dramatizations of mythological experiences, which are very archetypal to take people through this shifting of consciousness. And when you look at how ancient Greek culture, ancient Greek civilization um, affected the world, the modern world today, things like democracy and things like, just the ideas that were spawned during those times. Um, it was a very interesting era. So we've got Amrita, we've got Soma, we've got Kaikon, we've got, I don't know as far as, there are probably lots of things used in, um, I want to say like Southeast Asia, and I don't know enough about it um, to say what's there or what has been used traditionally. Um, but there's still, traditional healers in a lot of places, even when uh, religion came in and sort of took over and outlawed indigenous practices. Um, you'll still find a blending of those things going on, and sometimes there are indigenous cultures that survive in isolation, although that's becoming obviously much more rare these days. Um, I remember, well, not to go too far off topic, but I remember a few years back when there were, missionaries who tried to make it out to this remote island in the Indian Ocean that was actually protected because there was an indigenous tribe living there that hadn't had any contact with outsiders, and it's very dangerous. Oh, yeah, interesting. Mamo and Taita. I've heard the term Taita before, but I haven't heard the term Mamo. But I'm really interested in the different terminology used for shamans around the world. Uh, so one day I want to compile a list of different terms for shaman. The word we have in English is shaman. Not to go too far. Oh, Taita are the one with the Yahe. Yahe, I think you said, or Jahe. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. I'm sure I am. In the Amazon. Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, so where was I? Oh, so different terms for shamanism. I have heard it said by some folks that we should not use the word shaman in English because it's not our word, or whatever. Um, the issue with that is it is an English word. It's a loan word, a borrowed word. It didn't originate in English, but neither did more than half of the words in English. More than half of the words in English are borrowed in English. If you want to talk about the progression of like Old English to Middle English to um, is a succession of you know languages being pulled in and pulled together and borrowed from. So Old English, the precursors to Old English are Germanic. Like as a native English speaker, I can't understand Old English if I read it. It's a different language altogether. And then we had, the Norman invasions happen, and um, you know, we have inclusion of a lot of French in English, a lot of Latin borrowed into English because of religion and the court systems, and but there's Spanish words in English. There's even the word boondocks, down in the boondocks. Boondock is a Tagalog word, so that's borrowed from the Philippines, and so we have a lot of borrowed words in English. The word shaman came into English in the 17th century, so we have had this word since the 1600s in English. Shows up in dictionaries. So it is an English word, um, because we don't have another word for it. And yeah, it came from the Tungus people of Siberia, because back in the 1600s, an emissary from Holland went to Russia and Siberia, met with the Tungus people, wrote the word shaman. That's the first time we have the word shaman written down in a European language, um, that I'm aware of, that we're aware of. Came into English from the German and the Russian, actually, and we've been using it for hundreds of years. We don't have another word, unfortunately, in English. And anything else sounds a little bit pejorative. Things like witch doctor, right? um Medicine man, medicine woman, I guess. Okay, but we don't have another word, and so I continue to use the word shaman, even though well-meaning people sometimes say, "Oh, we shouldn't use that word because it's not ours to use." Um, and yeah, so indigenous cultures, like those in Colombia, and like those in North America, and like those in Africa, and like those in Asia, there are shamans everywhere. In Australia, Oceania, there are shamans everywhere. All of these cultures, they all have their own terms for the word. But shamanic culture in Europe was stamped down with the Christianization of Europe. So we see practices like Seth in Scandinavian countries, which was the traditional shamanic practice in Scandinavia. We see that being outlawed, for example. Laws passed against it very early on. Yeah, by all accounts, the Druids were probably, yeah, Druids were probably shamanic, although their role is really complex. So they were like the keepers of the law. They were like your court system um, in Celtic Europe, and they, yeah, certainly were the religious scholars, and they certainly presided over other, and there were other priests besides druids, and so the role of druid was really an interesting one, really, really an interesting one. Um, there's not necessarily a complete comparison, other than if you look at some places where the Christian church was essentially the law in the area. It essentially ran the courts, collected the taxes, all of those things. But the druids were doing. I don't know if they were collecting taxes, but they were certainly keepers of lore, they were ritualists, they were um, healers, they were herbalists, they were all kinds of stuff. So yeah, and there are other traditional words. There's a word in Irish, um, and I know it's Gaelic, but Irish Gaelic specifically, that is similar to shaman. It's somebody who goes into, it's like a soothsayer who goes into trance and I think sings prophecy or whatever, and I can't remember the word for that, but it exists, which tells you that that was a role in during that time, right? There wouldn't be a word for it if it didn't exist. In northern in northern Europe, in the Germanic, Scandinavian areas, we had the Wikti and the Wolva, who were Wolva is the female shaman and Vikti is the male shaman. Um, Mostly females did the divination stuff, which you also have the oracles in Greece, right? Like the Delphic oracle was always female. Um, and the stories are the oracles were there for thousands of years. So clearly this was something, this was not a human being living for thousands of years. I don't believe, like, it was passed on to the next person. And the oracles were breathing volcanic vapors, which were, having a psychedelic effect on them as well. So these are shamanic practices um, that we don't necessarily recognize as being shamanic practices. And even stories of Christian saints and things where they go into a state of reverie, and they're described sometimes as flying, um, and having visions. There is an interesting study, and there's a book written about it. I haven't read it, but in a lot of very early European Christian art, there are depictions of psychedelic mushrooms in the art. So you'll have an icon, for example, of Mother Mary holding Jesus, and surrounding that will be images of psychedelic mushrooms. And I don't know that enough research has been done into that to determine why that is the case, other than it's very possible that they were used in ceremonies as people were converting from paganism into Christianity. That there was a continuation of the use of these substances in the churches and local churches. But you can Google it. You can Google psychedelic mushrooms in early Christian art. And there's a paper written about it and a book by, I think, a couple. I don't know if they're a couple, but it's written by two people. Um, Maybe they're a couple, and um, it's just that's fascinating to me. So, if you know me, I teach shamanism. I do not use plant medicine in my teaching or my practice, mainly because it's it's not necessary to learn how to journey. And if people want to journey with plant medicine, they should go to somebody who is an expert, do it in the safest possible way. Um, and I don't like the other aspect to that is the legality issue, right? So the US had a very draconian, as many places do, very draconian drug policy for decades, where we would, lock people away forever for um, you know, cannabis, for example. Um, and it's not at all based on things like harm, right? So harm reduction would include tighter restrictions on things like alcohol. Alcohol, so anybody of age, assumingly, or with a fake ID, can go buy alcohol. It's very easy to get alcohol. It's very easy to make your own alcohol. Aren't restrictions on it. They tried. We had prohibition, And what it did was it made a lot of gangsters very wealthy, people who didn't care about the law and ran alcohol. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think so. For things like that, particularly ayahuasca, um, ayahuasca can be very dangerous because it is serotonergic. I may be mispronouncing that, but it affects serotonin levels. And there have been people who have died from serotonin syndrome from taking ayahuasca. It's not something to be done recreationally for sure. Um, and having somebody responsible with a connection to the plant medicine and a lifetime of training and a history, a lineage of instruction, I think that's important, particularly for stuff like that, for things like iboga as well. Um, for use some caution. But if we look at harm, right, and harm reduction, so alcohol, we try to prohibit alcohol in the U.S., and it made a lot of people like to drink, and so it made a lot of gangsters very, very wealthy. People formed a black market. Well, the same thing happened with the drug trade. Cannabis, for example, is by all accounts, I've never grown cannabis, but by all accounts, it grows everywhere. It's really easy to grow, um, whatever. But uh, when making cannabis illegal, brought in billions and billions and billions of dollars of revenue to violent drug cartels, who then use that money to buy military grade weapons and cause a lot of harm. When we look at the overall picture of it, the prohibition of cannabis in the U.S. has caused, by all accounts, and not just this isn't just me talking, has caused way more harm to the world in general, but also to the U.S. and cost us so much money and all of this stuff. We haven't protected anybody from anything, and it's by all measures of harm, it's a less harmful thing than alcohol, which is legal. And the same can be said for psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybin mushrooms very, very low on the harm scale. And how they measure harm is they measure things like overdoses. They measure things like hospitalizations, injuries, deaths, um, property damage and crime, and it's a very complicated formula. And they're able to look at all of these substances independently, and people who do these studies and see which drugs are most harmful. Alcohol is at the top of the list. Psilocybin mushrooms close to the bottom of the list. You know, they're just in cannabis. Cannabis is practically harmless, other than there have been societal damages from it being illegal. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining. Yeah, so you can watch online. You can these are recorded and they're available on Facebook and YouTube and wherever else they happen to be available. But I know Facebook and YouTube for sure. But yeah, I've done some writing about this and will probably do more. So anyway, in my state, they legalized cannabis first medically and then recreationally, or they decriminalized it. Anyway, it's not a crime in Maine to have a certain amount. Like, there are restrictions, but I think they're fairly loose. Restrictions on what you can possess personally. Selling is a whole other thing. Like, you can't sell cannabis without a license. You can't give it to people under 21. You can't, there are lots of regulations about it. So, when it came in and there was time to legalize it, the opposing side, um, what happened with them is that they really demonized it, and they really talked about oh, you're going to have car accidents all over the road from people being high and driving, and you're going to have surgeons who are high killing people. And, it was all of this doom and gloom stuff. And I said, well, does the research really bear that out? Or is this just, is this people catastrophizing what's going to happen? And the research hasn't borne that out, right? Because people who were abusing cannabis before and then driving were still doing that. It didn't stop people from doing that. And the people who were responsible and waited for cannabis to become legalized are careful about driving with it. And it's the same as the case for alcohol. There's still people who drink and drive, um, and cause car accidents, and it's terrible. But if we made alcohol illegal, and this is where, does prohibition necessarily make things harder to get? Um, I don't know. I knew somebody who had spent time in prison, and as the result of a drug habit, he he got addicted very early in life, a teenager, and wound up, stealing or whatever to support his drug habit. Has decades of, recovery and doing the right thing, living, on the straight and narrow. But um, he spent time in prison, and he told me it was way easier for him to get drugs in prison than it was than it was like out in public, out in the real world. I don't know if that's true every place, but in a place that's that locked down, that um, restricted, still getting access to that stuff just tells you people will access what they want to from a substance perspective. The other the other aspect to consider about decriminalization and things, and I'm on the fence. It's a complicated issue when it comes to decriminalizing all drugs. For example, there are certain things like fentanyl, which is killing people by the dozens out there. Um, but as a human being, as an adult human being with free will and the ability to educate myself and all of these things, um, I believe in the sovereignty of the body, the individual, my choice to put whatever I want into my body. Knowing what the 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 potential outcomes can be, as long as I'm informed. But again, like, it's not a rights issue. If somebody gives me something, you know, here, try this gummy bear, eat a gummy bear, like, oh, by the way, that had something in it. Well, I'm not consenting to that, right? I don't have informed consent. But adults with informed consent, I believe, should have sovereignty over their body. They should be able to make every choice they want to with regards to what happens with their body. If you don't have that, you are essentially a ward or possession of the state or whoever else it is that is making those choices for you. This isn't to say I think that I'm not advocating everybody go out and do psychedelics or whatever, whatever, or go out and get addicted to substances or whatever, what have you. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying people should be free to make choices and live with the repercussions of that. They should understand. People should understand what they're getting into. They don't always, but regardless, we should be treating adults like adults, treating human beings like human beings who have sovereignty over their physical bodies. So, I think, be able to consume whatever it is that I choose. Um, without restriction. Selling is another thing. Giving stuff to minors is another thing. Obviously, there are problems with that, and that we should be cautious about. Um, but one of the issues with driving psychedelics underground is that it opens up this huge black market, um, clearly we've got things like the dark web, and I get, I'm sure for certain things there are, I know there's got to be, quote unquote dealers out there. I've seen I've seen people getting arrested for doing drug deals, not that long ago, not where I live, but in the town I grew up in anyway. um and it's all these days, it's all like fentanyl and stuff. But I do think like medical I haven't seen statistics on this for my state yet, but in other places, the legalization of medical cannabis has reduced reliance on opioids. And that to me is a hugely beneficial effect to the use of medical cannabis. Um, so I will not, uh, I won't take a position on the use of psychedelics in shamanism to say that you should or you shouldn't. I know there are plenty of practitioners out there who have very, very strong opinions about it. I'll say that it's not part of my teaching. It's not what I teach. I don't teach plant medicine. I don't use plant medicine in my ceremonies. It's not necessary. You can do everything, but it is powerful, and it is a powerful way to heal. And the research going on right now is showing huge, huge benefits for things like PTSD, depression, anxiety. I don't know about other factors, but uh, the neuroplasticity effect, and the use of entheogens. I'll use that term with people who are dying, right? People who are in the death process from a terminal illness has shown a lot of promise to help comfort people in that time. To help them face their mortality without, you know, suffering from extreme anxiety or whatever. Once um, part of my training was to go through death and dying experiences. And once you do that, once you go deeply into that stuff, it starts to dissolve your fear of your mortality a bit. So, why not? Why would we not comfort? What are we worried about with use of psychedelics in somebody who's terminally ill and in the last stages of living? Why wouldn't we allow people at that point to do whatever they want? Like, what harm could come from that, right? A lot of these substances aren't addictive. They don't trigger dopamine reactions, so they're not technically physically addictive. But even if they were, are we worried about a terminally ill person getting addicted, or a terminally ill person going out and you know causing harm somehow, robbing people to get access to um, medicine? No. So it's not about harm reduction necessarily, although there have been harms caused with psychedelics when unscrupulous entities were dosing people um, without their consent and knowledge. Like that absolutely should remain, but that's true for anything. If I gave you a drink with alcohol in it and I masked the taste of alcohol enough and didn't tell you I was serving you alcohol, that should not be allowed, right? Um, right, drugging somebody against their will is not okay. And the way that they were, dosing people in all of these government experiences, they were trying to use it for, as always, will pervert technology, even ancient technologies, for warfare. Right, they were using it to see if they could use it as mind control on large populations or certain populations. Experimented a lot with LSD and substances like that back in the 60s and 70s. We're worried about those communists taking over, so we had to use everything at our disposal, including um, psychedelic drugs that were coming out of the hippie movement of the 60s and the a lot of stuff going on in universities. There's a lot of stuff going on at Harvard at the time, back in the day. Um, but regardless, so um, I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who is in the psychedelic space. She's working with um, people to help decriminalize it in my state, at least psilocybin. I don't know about other substances. MDMA is about to be legalized for medical uses. I think it's a shoe in at this point. They're in stage 3 clinical trials with FDA. So we'll see MDMA assisted therapy any day now. We already have ketamine assisted therapy. Will we have other psychedelics assisted therapy? Sure. But one of the problems with having medical use only is that it becomes prohibitive because of the medical structure. The way that medicine works in the US is that it's very expensive. Expensive to see a doctor, expensive to purchase medicine. We don't have universal healthcare or socialized medicine here. So everything's really, really expensive. So if they have legal exemptions for medical, say they get medical psilocybin, which was a law they tried to pass but failed in my state just recently. Only medical only legalization. You'll have clinics and whatever open up, but it'll be prohibitive to a lot of people who don't have the money to access that. And what's to say people do, or people with money need that more than people without money, or what have you. So it's a little bit, it's a step in the right direction, but it is a little bit problematic, because you'll have certainly underserved communities and underserved people who won't have access because they don't have the money. Um, you know, um, I'll say that, I don't know. I don't think like low dose ketamine therapy, for example, I don't think that's covered by most insurances at this point because it's an off books use of that medication. So we'll see. I don't know. I don't know what insurance will cover and that sort of thing. So we'll see. But I do think I do think most psychedelics should be decriminalized. But I also think people should use caution and not just use them recreationally. You can use them as medicine to heal. You can use them in ceremony. Use them in the right context. But to the points of several people earlier, set and setting are incredibly important. Using something ritually, in a ceremony conducted by somebody who is trained to know what they're doing. And I am not. It's one of the reasons I don't use, besides the legality of it, I wouldn't use psychedelics in ceremony, is that I'm not trained for that. And it would be incredibly unethical for me to put people in that position, or to believe that I could lead ceremony in a way that I couldn't. That being said, there are now a lot of people training to become psychedelic because they're seeing that psychedelics are the future of medicine in the West. A lot of legalization pushes, that sort of thing. Um, there are people rushing to go through psychedelic integration training, which is you become a specialist in integration. And some of these are okay, I'm sure, and some of them are, sort of fly by night. They see money, they see dollar signs, and so, you can take a weekend class and get a certificate, or whatever. Where some of the training is much more intense that I'm aware of. I don't know fully about what is involved to become an integration helper specialist, whatever. Um, so that being said, caution is always warranted in use of these powerful substances. What can happen is there is an opening effect. So they open you up to um, perceive spiritual realities, things that are happening. This is where the quote unquote hallucinations come in. It's just an opening of the perceptual doors, that allows more stuff to flood into consciousness, and your brain's trying to make sense of that. So it's giving you all of these experiences that you haven't had before. Um, you have a good or bad experience either way. Um, but for those psychedelics that create neuroplasticity, that's really important. And I'd like to see um, more, looking at these substances that encourage neuroplasticity with other neurological conditions. I don't know if they're being studied for things like, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other sort of brain disorders like that. But it would be really interesting to see if there's any benefit there, to you know to doing that kind of thing. Um, there is some really, really interesting research, non psychedelic research on dementia and using gamma cycles. And so I think right now there are very few human studies, but they did this with mice who they can alter the genes of mice to give them dementia essentially. And they expose them to gamma frequencies, which are high, in the spectrum of brain waves. These are high frequency, like pulses of sound or pulses of light, and their memory improved. And what happens is when these lights pulse, our brain starts to synchronize with that. And it's a phenomenon called entrainment, where our brain waves will follow the waves of sound or lights or whatever, and can actually uh, stimulate um, areas of the brain that clean out the chemicals that cause Alzheimer's, at least in mice. I'd like to see some human studies happening. So um, things that things that can affect our neurology positively without having serious negative physical effects. I'd like to see more of that. So with that, I'm a little bit over time. I've got to run. My cat is yelling at me from the other room. I don't know if you can hear that or not. Probably not. But thank you all for joining again today. Great to see some familiar faces. Great to have other contributions. I always learn stuff from people who come on here, which is great for me. Hopefully, great for everybody. People come in and share thoughts and knowledge and that sort of thing. And with that, I will leave you for today. Thank you for joining. I love you all. We'll talk to you real soon.